Welcome back, everyone. Today we will be reading chapter 15, and it's going to be a little short today. It's just long enough to not be able to add with chapter 16, so we're just going to have a short episode today. Chapter 15. Oh, the return of the prodigal. The rapture with which Julia was received back into the domestic fold, the blurry, beaming faces of her parents, a pair of rain-soaked headlights trained upon her, as she presented herself to them in the form of a reprobate reformed. She had disappointed them so many times in so many ways, they hardly dared to hope any more. They'd been through so many stages of grief they'd lost count. Now, here she was, returned from Chesterton, her spirit crushed, ready to be part of the family again. And they let her. They actually let her. With a kindness utterly unlike anything she recognized in herself, they took her back, even though she could not have deserved it less. The wreck of the good ship Julia, out of Brooklyn, carrying the precious cargo of their love, was ready to be hauled off the reef of life and salvaged and refloated. And they did it. They took her back without a word of reproach. Now, it was Julia's turn to grieve, and they let her, which was another gift. She mourned her lost life, and she mourned the death of the magician she would never be. She buried that mighty sorceress with full honors, and with the grief unbidden came its ghostly golden cousin, relief. She had been trying so hard for so long to be something the world did not want her to be. Now she could finally stop. The world had won. She yielded to her family's embraces, and she was grateful for them. What was so great about magic anyway, compared to love? Seriously, what? Oh, the timorous overtures of her sister, the humanist. By now, she was a senior in high school herself. As she labored over her college applications, Julia reactivated her own. They worked on them together, side by side, at the kitchen table, swapping tips, her sister coaching her on her essay, Julia dragging her sister through basic calculus by main force. They were a team again, the two of them. Julia had forgotten what it felt like to be part of a family. She'd forgotten how good it could feel, and how much she needed it. Of Julia's legendary 7 acceptances, only Stanford's could be salvaged, but that was enough. There was a gap or 3 in her resume, sure, but if you cocked your head and blurred your eyes, you could take her magical research for some sort of worthy independent ethnographic project. So it was sunny California for her. Just what she needed. Fun in the sun. Put some color in her cheeks. She'd spend a year saving up cash and matriculate in the fall. It was all arranged. Because Julia had given up. She was packing it in. She washed her hands of the realms invisible that had so thoroughly washed their hands of her. She would take a page from the holy book of those child-raping utopian socialists she'd written about for Mr. Carraz. When your sacred intentional community collapses, it's time to suck it up and sell silverware instead. Julia would take a page from Jack Donne. At the end of the poem, hadn't he run to the goat? By which he meant the constellation Capricorn, a footnote gallantry informed her. To find new love? Or was it lust? Or maybe it turned out it was too late for him. Maybe that was somebody else. That poem was pretty fucking unintelligible. Anyway, it had a happy ending. Ish. She still had her bad days, no question, when the black dog of depression sniffed her out and settled its crushing weight on her chest and breathed its pungent dog breath in her face. On those days, she called in sick to the IT shop where most days she untangled tangled networks for a song. On those days, she pulled down the shades and ran dark for 12 or 24 or 72 hours, however long it took for the black dog to go on home to its dark master. She couldn't go back. She knew that now. The Magic Kingdom was closed to her. But some days she couldn't see a way forward either. She always righted herself in the end, with the help of a dandy cat-eyed new shrink, a woman this time, and her dandy 450 milligrams of Wellbutrin and 30 milligrams of Lexapro daily, and her dandy new online support group for the depressed. Actually, the support group really was pretty dandy. It was something special. It was founded by a woman who'd worked successively at Apple, and then Microsoft, and then Google. She blazed a glittering arc in the firmament at each firm for about 4 or 5 years, piling up tranches of stock options, before she rolled neurochemical snake eyes and a bout of clinical depression knocked her out of the sky. By the time Google was done with her, she was 44 and her fuck you money in the bank. So she retired early and started Free Trader Beowulf instead. Free Trader Beowulf. You had to be at least 40 and a recovering pen and paper role-playing gamer to get the reference. But it was apt. Google it. FTB. FTB was an online support group for depressed people, but not your common run of depressed person. Oh no. To get in the door, you first had to show them your prescriptions. They wanted credentials, solid ones. A bunch of nerds like this. They didn't want to hear you whining, and they didn't want to read your poems. Sorry, Jack. Or look at your doomy watercolors. This crowd wasn't softcore. If you were depressed, they wanted to see the hard stuff, a diagnosis from an actual psychiatrist, and hardcore chemical on neuron action. And if you were rocking double neurochemical penetration, like Julia was, all the better. If that all worked out, then they sent you a video invitation. It was meaningless in itself, a red herring, just a bunch of new agey platitudes, delivered by a systematic hippie-type actor. But buried in it, for those who thought to look, was a clue. A single frame of what looked like white noise, but which turned out to be hard data. The black and white pixels stood for ones and zeros that, when laid end to end, formed a sound file. The audio was of somebody speaking the phone number of an old-school dial-up BBS, which, when you called it up, frog-marched you through a pretty chunky series of pure math problems, which, if you solved them in 6 hours or less, yielded a sequence of numbers that turned out to be alarm numbers. Alarm being the password to the website at the IP address they gave you if you beat the test. Where there was a flash game that made absolutely no sense unless you could think in 4 spatial dimensions. But if you could, you got a pair of GPS coordinates in South Dakota that turned out to be a geocaching site from which you could recover a grotesquely complicated 3-dimensional wooden puzzle, inside of which was etc., etc., etc. All good, clean, all-American fun. A childless, clinically depressed, 44-year-old retiree with a genius IQ and an 8-figure bank account had nothing if not time on her hands. It was obnoxious, but nobody was twisting Julia's arm. And she had time on her hands, too, as it happened. It took Julia 3 weeks to work her way through the intellectual obstacle course. She would have liked to see Quentin try it, but at the end of it, all she recovered, on the strength of many quarters, a plastic bubble from the claw machine, and a neglected video arcade on the Jersey Shore. The bubble contained a flash drive. The flash drive contained the real invitation. No tricks this time. She was in. Free Trader Beowulf had 14 members, and Julia made it 15. It was only a message board, but it felt more like home than anything had since the 2 hours Julia had spent at Breakbills 4 years earlier. The people in FTB got her. She didn't have to explain herself. They understood her gallows humor and her Gödel, Escher, Bach references, her sudden rages and her long silences. She picked up their arcane in-jokes and running gags pretty quickly. Her whole life, she'd felt like the last living member of a lost Amazonian tribe, speaking her own extinct dialect, but here, finally, was her ethnic group. They were a bunch of depressed, overeducated shut-ins, but they seemed human to her. Or maybe not human. But whatever Julia was, they were too. References to real life were tactfully discouraged on FTB. You didn't use real names. In most cases, she had only the vaguest sense of where the other members lived or what they did for a living, whether they were married or, in a few cases, even what gender they were. As far as Julia knew, they never met in person. FTB just wasn't a meat space thing. Outing another member's real-world identity was an offense punishable by expulsion, or it would have been if it ever happened, but it never did. Welcome to Faceless Book, an antisocial network. That spring was the happiest time Julia had lived through since her old life ended. She chattered away to the free traders all day, every day. They hung around her in an invisible crowd, bantering and kibitzing on her work projects. She typed while she ate her breakfast. She typed walking down the street. The last thing she saw before she fell asleep was the Free Trader app on her smartphone on the pillow next to her, and it was the first thing she saw when she opened her eyes in the morning. She opened herself up to them in a way she never had to anyone. No irony, no kavats, no regrets. She poured out her broken heart to the Free Traders, and they took it all and cleaned it up and fixed it up and gave it back to her fresh and bloody and pumping again. She never said a thing about Breakbills. That would have been beyond the pale even for FTB. But she found to her relief that she didn't really have to. Whatever was wrong, the details didn't matter. It was enough for them to know that there was an enormous piece missing from her world, and they understood what that felt like because they were missing pieces too. Didn't matter what shape it was, Julia wouldn't have been surprised to learn that there were a few Breakbills also Rons among the free traders, but she never asked. She had warm feelings for all the free traders, but inevitably there were a few with whom she formed tighter bonds, a little clique, a circle within the circle, comprising herself and 3 others. Falstaff, a gentle poster whose cultural references put him 3 or 4 decades older than Julia. Pouncy Silverkitten, whose acid sarcasm was extreme even for FTB, but who chose his targets humanely, mostly. And Asmodeus, who understood Julia's feelings with telepathic completeness, and whose faculty with theoretical physics was so extraordinary she seemed to be posting from somewhere off-planet. Julia posted as Vicious Circe. They'd been a trio before she came along, but they were happy to accept her as one of them, and to make their never-ending conversations four-handed. It was acceptable on FTB to take a thread private, if all parties agreed, and once in a while, she and Asmo and Pouncy and Falstaff would recede into their own highly abstract world together. In those private threads, they would get a little more concrete about their personal lives, though it was still considered gauche to drop any geospecific details. That became part of the game, keeping their identities obscure, and another part of the game was constructing elaborate fictional biographies and resumes for each other. Julia did an FBI serial killer profile for each of the other three, complete with police sketches. Another game they were fond of was called Series. It was simple. Somebody would provide 3 words or 3 numbers or names or molecules or shapes or whatever. Those were the first 3 terms in the series. Then you had to figure out what the next term in the series was and what principle generated it. You wanted to make your series maximally difficult but still theoretically solvable, while also making sure there was only one possible solution, i.e., only one guiding principle that could be extrapolated from the 3 examples. Once the solution was cracked, second prize went to the first person who could iterate the series 10 times. FTB took over her life, and she led it. Sometimes, even when she was offline, it was as if FTB was running by itself in her head. Her brain had spent so much time with these invisible personalities that they'd calved off little clones of themselves in her brain. Pirate software versions of Asmo and Pouncy and Failstaff and all the others that ran on Julia's hardware. She was demented. She wasn't. She wasn't demented. She wasn't. It was just a game she played with herself. It was a little insane, but hey, whatever got you through, right? And everything else was going fine. She'd gained weight, stopped scratching herself, barely even bit her cuticles anymore. She hadn't done the rainbow spell in ages. She knew she was obsessed, but it was turning out that she was the kind of person who needed to be obsessed with something. And she could have done a lot worse. God knows she had before. She figured, let the fever run its course. It would break, and the patient would wake up clammy but clear-headed, and the fever dreams would fade. She'd head off to Stanford in the fall, get a new life, get some real-world, visible, analog friends, wipe the slate clean. But first, she'd give it its head, let it run a little. Which is how Julia found herself late on a weekend afternoon in March, wandering through Prospect Heights toward Bedstuy. Become a prodigious walker of late, because she needed some kind of exercise, and exposure to sunlight improved her mood. And she could take the free traders with her, not only in their capacity as spectral presences in her brain, but as actual presences on her smartphone, for which Failstaff had ginned up a clever little app. No iPhones, natch. Android only. The free traders were huge open-source snobs. She strode the earth, clad in the invisible armor of their virtual companionship. Julia typed as she walked. She had developed a great faculty in doing this, using her peripheral vision to weave around fire hydrants and dogshit landmines and other pedestrians. A key part of successfully being Julia, it seemed, was not giving a shit if you looked weird. Today, she half listened via the app's text-to-speech feature, while Pouncy and Asmodeus went back and forth on the validity of Hofstadter's strange loop theory of consciousness as derived from Gödel numbers, or something like that. The other half of her consciousness, Hofstadterian, or no, was deployed in looking at the front doors of the houses she passed. Specifically, she was looking at the way they were divided up into square and rectangular panels of different sizes. Most of them were, anyway. This was not on the face of it an overwhelmingly interesting activity. In fact, she would have been hard-pressed to explain to anybody exactly why she was doing it. It was just that the doors had begun to remind her of a game of series they'd played the other day. Pouncey had offered up a geometrical puzzle painstakingly executed in ASCII characters, consisting of simple patterns and squares on a small grid. It had turned out Falstaff nailed it, that the patterns could be understood as successive states of a very simple cellular automation. So simple that they could nut out the rules in their heads once they had the general idea. Or Falstaff could, anyway. The funny thing was, Julia fancied that as she walked, she could spot sequences from the series and the different configurations of the doors she was passing. It seemed like she kept going long enough she could always find the next term. It was just a goofy mental exercise. Sometimes the pattern was in wood, sometimes in glass, or a wrought iron gate. Once, it was in cinder blocks and a blocked-up window, which was cheating. But it was weird how often she found it. She started setting rules for herself. She would stop walking if it took her more than a block to find the next term in the series. Then, it had to be within a block and on the same side of the street, and so on. But the right pattern always turned up just in time. She wasn't sure if this was a significant discovery or not, but she felt a compulsion to see how long she could keep it going. She could imagine the acidity of the sarcasm Pouncey would slather all over her if she told the others what she was doing. It would be seriously corrosive, pH 0 sarcasm. It was all working out very neatly, though. The only difference between her and Pouncey's cellular automa was that hers was running backward. The rules were being applied in reverse, so it was winding back down to its initial state. That was another reason she kept walking. The series was finite. It would be over soon, whatever happened. Once she got lost for a block, but then she realized she'd munged the transformation, and once she fixed it, then sure enough, there it was. An old wooden door with inset panels, 3 of them slightly lighter in color to pick out the right configuration. It was a will-o'-the-wisp leading her onward. Farther into the perilous marsh of Bedstowey, deeper into a dreamlike, hypnagogic state. A small but vigilant sector of Julia's brain wasn't that stoked about how far into Bedstowey she was getting. Row houses were giving way to vacant lots and chop shops and half-built apartment houses that the recession had killed off before they were finished. She had about an hour before dark, and it was no longer possible to tell herself that some of the houses were boarded up because they were undergoing very ambitious gut renovations, because those houses weren't being renovated. They were crack houses. But it wouldn't be long before she found the door that corresponded to Pouncey's starting configuration, and then the series would be at an end, which is to say, at its beginning, and she could turn around and head back to Park Slope. And sure enough, just past Throop, pronounced Troop, Avenue, there it was. It was not a pretty house, but it wasn't a crack house either. It was a 2-story lime green clapboard house with an antique rabbit ears antenna on top and a surly gang of aluminum garbage cans in the cracked cement yard out front. The front door was an 8-paned glass affair. One pane, the top left corner, had been punched out and plastic wrapped, thereby completing the series. And that was that. It was finished. The sight of that final pattern, the initial state, released Julia from the spell. The dream logic had iterated itself out. She looked around like a sleepwalker awakened, wondered where the hell she was exactly. Somebody was still babbling in her ear in a computer-generated voice about Hofstadter. Exhaustion broke over her in a wave. She must have walked for miles, and the sun was setting. She sat down on the stoop. She needed a ride home. A car service would be expensive, but being mugged and or assaulted would be even more expensive. Plus, she felt like she would literally drop in her tracks if she had to take another step. She killed the FTB app and took out her earbuds. And the voices died away. Silence. Reality. Behind her, she heard the door open. She got up again and held up a hand. Okay, she was going. She didn't suppose that a lecture on cellular automa would really pass for an excuse for trespassing with the residents of some random lime green shitbox house on Troop Avenue. But the guy in the door wasn't shooing her away. He was a white guy, owlish looking, maybe 30, in a vintage blazer and jeans and an insta-annoying pork pie hat. He just looked at her, assessing. Behind him, she could see other people in the house, sitting and standing, chatting and moping, and doing things with their hands. Only they didn't have anything in their hands. A weird acid green light flared for a second in the doorway from somewhere she couldn't see. Like there was welding going on in there. Somebody gave an ironic cheer. The air absolutely reeked of magic. You could barely breathe, it was so thick. Julia squatted down on her haunches and on the sidewalk like a toddler, and put her head in her hands and laughed and cried at the same time. She felt like she was going to pass out or throw up or go insane. She had tried to walk away from the disaster, to run away from it. She really, truly had. She'd broken her staff and drowned her book and sworn off magic forever. She'd moved on and left no forwarding address. But it hadn't been enough. Magic had come looking for her. She hadn't run far enough or fast enough or hid herself well enough, and the disaster had tracked her down, and it had found her. It wasn't going to let her go. It was about to start all over again. That's it for this week, and we will see you guys next week with Chapter 16.